Hello and welcome to Live from America podcast. This is Hatem alongside me, my friend Noam Dworman, the owner of the Comedy Cellar and the host of the podcast as well. Hello, Noam.
Hello, Hatem.
Good to see you. And we have a very special guest. One of my favorite. He's been here before, and he's so amazing, and his book is so amazing that we had to get him back. He's one of the finest cardiologists in New York City, and he's a frequent contributor for the New York Times opinion page and the author of the new memoir, My Father's Brain: Life in the Shadow of Alzheimer's. And it's coming in paperback, right? It's coming out now
Yeah,
soon. Yeah.
it just came out actually in paperback.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
And he is one of the main doctors that were in the hospital that saved my life twice. So
Wow.
special heart there. So
Did,
he's a
did, did,
cardiologist. One a big, and we're gonna talk about why a cardiologist writes about Alzheimer's later. But how you doing?
wait. I have some questions. Oh, go. How are you doing? Go ahead.
I'm doing fine.
I didn't realize this. So were you in the operating room when Hatem got his heart transplant?
No, I was not, but my colleagues were.
Well,
So
that's an
I
amazing thing you guys did. You saved our Hatem. That's wonderful. And and then I don't know if you must have a lot of cases, but he had COVID right afterwards. Were you aware of? And was there a time you thought he wasn't going to make it?
so I wasn't intimately involved in the case, but I know that the doctors who were, and I mean, without getting into all the nitty-gritty of the medical stuff, but I know that uh, they recently talked about him in one of our meetings and said that he was doing really well and everyone was really pleased. So yeah, I mean, it is somewhat of a miracle that you can take a heart from someone who's dead and basically give life to someone else. So yeah, it's amazing.
That ringing means that you're speaking the truth. Um, and the other question I had about it, I mean, Hatem was just telling me the other night that there's a recurring pattern with people who they have multiple transplants. The first transplant eventually expires in some way, and then they had to have another heart transplant. Is that right?
I mean, it can happen, yes.
Uh,
So, I mean, transplants are a huge success story. The early transplants back in the late 60s were were problematic because, we didn't understand immunosuppression. We didn't
mhm.
understand how to prevent organ rejection. Um, Sometimes we gave too much immunosuppression, and patients got, infections that were life-threatening. Um, we didn't give enough, and patients rejected their hearts. So it was, but since then, things have, dramatically improved. So, if you survive the first year after a transplant, because that's when the risk is the highest, because you have to make sure you don't have acute rejection, and then there are all sorts of like surgical issues that might come up. But if you can survive the first year, the average lifespan of a transplant heart is about 15 years or so, and there are patients who go out to 25 years. Um, but yeah, I mean, there is sort of a lifespan of the transplanted heart. They can get kind of low level rejection. There can be coronary disease, just like you and I can get coronary disease from excess cholesterol, high blood pressure, whatever.
Mhm.
So then yeah, then we have to go to a second transplant. But nowadays there's a very effective treatment, which is sort of an artificial pump called an LVAD that
I had
you
that
have a
before
lot of
that.
what's that?
I had an LVAD before the heart.
You had an LVAD, yeah. So do you had a HeartMate 3?
Yes.
Yeah. So the HeartMate 3s are the only LVAD available now. All the other LVADs have kind of bit the dust. The HeartMate 3 is the gold standard LVAD, and patients do really well with it. Like there used to be problems with bleeding and clots and infections, but the patients we have on HeartMate 3 do incredibly well. I mean, surprisingly well. So that's another option for you, you know, down the line. So anyway, yeah.
It's amazing,
Yeah.
amazing.
I promise I will make an episode one day. I still cannot talk about it too much, but I kind
Yeah.
of blocked it. But Dr. Sandeep have an amazing TED talk. It's called "Does your How Your Emotion Change the Shape of Your Heart." Everybody should listen to it. But let's. It's actually very interesting how the shape. It's very good TED talk. So let's talk about Alzheimer. What for those who didn't hear or listen to the first episode, why did you, a cardiologist, decide to write an amazing book about Alzheimer's?
Well, I mean, so sorry, I'm getting phone calls.
That's
Oh, no.
okay. It's okay.
So yeah, you know, I wrote the book because, most people don't know a lot about Alzheimer's and dementia. Most people either have had a loved one with Alzheimer's, or like a grandmother, grandfather, parent, friend, or have actively taken care of someone with Alzheimer's. So it affects all of us, but the level of knowledge about dementia is so poor, in part because we don't know what causes it. So, I know a lot about the heart, and I would say modern medicine knows a lot about the heart. The heart was like one of the first frontiers where we kind of, I would say, mastered in many ways the organ. If you look at uh, heart therapies that we now take for granted, pacemakers, defibrillators, heart transplants, LVADs, um, you know, statin drugs, all the stuff that stents, bypass surgery, all that stuff was essentially invented um, after World War II, in most cases in America. So, you know, I come from a field that's like just brimming with knowledge. And when I was faced with a family medical problem, a huge problem with my father who developed Alzheimer's, you know, I'd say somewhat naively, I thought, okay, well, there has to be a lot more knowledge about such a huge problem. And the reality is that there isn't. We don't know what causes Alzheimer's. And I think that lack of knowledge, lack of understanding, affects us as caregivers. We become, like I did, impatient. You know, why can't you remember, Dad? Like, try harder. Um, and so I wrote the book because part of it is just a personal story of what I dealt with, what my family dealt with, that I think will be very familiar to people who have had loved ones who've had dementia. But part of it is also like a neurological uh, expose, of what dementia is, where it starts in the brain, how it which brain structures it affects. And the reason why that's important is that when you know the underlying uh, physiology, I think it helps you as a caregiver, because when your loved one starts acting in bizarre ways, it's easier to remind yourself, okay, well, that's because this is happening, rather than, oh, they're just being willful, or they're being, difficult, or, just making my life hard. It's hard to escape that kind of thinking, because taking care of someone with dementia is so difficult. And so, a lot of caregivers will say, look, I get frustrated, I get impatient, whatever. So I wrote a book that I needed, that would have explained to me exactly what I was dealing with, and I think would have made me a better caregiver.
So you feel some guilt in some way that you were impatient, or that you were short in some way with your dad. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, it's impossible not to feel that,
Mm-hmm.
to be honest. Uh, you know, I traveled the country, talking to people, caregivers. I even went internationally. I looked at novel care strategies, like in the Netherlands. You know, novel sort of nursing home facilities and how they're dealing with dementia. So I got a very kind of, you know, disparate perspectives international, national, whatever. And there's a few things that I was able to gather. So, some things that were kind of consistent um, across countries and cultures. One is that being a caregiver is really hard. The people who tend to bear the brunt of the caregiving are usually female, either a daughter or daughter-in-law. This tends to be true across cultures. And yeah, I mean, there's some, sort of basic things that I came to understand. And one of them especially was that caregivers, I would say virtually all caregivers have regrets. It's impossible not to, because it's such a long and drawn out kind of process. Really a slow shutting off of the lights, that it's impossible not to have moments of frustration and moments that you regret. And I would say that's been very consistent in my experience throughout, talking, interviewing people. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are things that I wish I had done differently. I mean, obviously, I wish I had sort of not pushed my father to like conquer his problem. Look, if you try hard, if you try to remember, Dad, you're gonna like, it was just a very irrational response that if he tries harder, maybe he can slow the
Progress.
the deterioration of his disease. So that was one aspect, but I'd say another big aspect that a lot of people regret is that we tend to marginalize people who have cognitive impairment, because what we value in this world are people who know how to think, people who know how to process information, people who know how to respond to us in, you know, uh, consistent, appropriate ways. When you lose that, you tend to get socially marginalized. And this happened with my dad. It happened with people with dementia all the time. Friends sort of, you know, fall away. They don't, and some of it's understandable, because how do you be a friend? What do you do with your friends? You spend time with them, you bond over shared history or current events. When you can't do that, then it's hard to be a friend to someone. And what I found is that not only do friends fall away, but then family members also start to feel very, very frustrated. And so, yeah, I mean, I think the more we know about dementia, the better caregivers we can be.
Do we know how they feel? Like, do we know, like, the person with dementia knows that we're being frustrated or being, so that affect them, make them feel bad about themselves as well, or no?
Absolutely.
They do.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that happens. That happened with my dad. I mean, as hard as I would try not to show that I was frustrated, it would come out. And, and, thing that we don't realize, we realize it on some level, but day to day in the moment, we don't realize that the person with dementia, they're not deliberately acting in ways that are irrational. They're acting in ways that are consistent with how their brain is functioning. And so are you as a caregiver. So we're both prisoners of our own brains. And the problem is that the brains are so different and the worldviews are so different that we can't find common ground. And I think that's why there's so much tension in the caregiver relationship with someone who has dementia. It's different if you're caring for someone who has a physical ailment, but with dementia, your personality changes, your worldview changes, your sense of ethics may change. And that's not just for the person who has dementia, but even the caregiver. Caregivers have to learn, in some cases, to lie to people they're taking care of, because sharing difficult truths can be very painful for.
I remember one of to your point is like when I was in the hospital and like obviously tubes everywhere before the surgery. I see myself. I can look at myself because I'm like kind of tied everywhere. I see myself through the eyes of the people walking in. Like when my ex-girlfriend came in and she saw me and cry, I was like, I must be horrible. Like the way you know, people react to it. That's why like a lot of the doctors were, and with the masks, I remember when the first COVID came mask, a lot of people were scared because we don't know what's going on. They will have a picture of the nurse or the doctor here, so you know who you're talking to.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right. No, go
No, but
ahead.
I
You
mean,
want to say something?
Yeah.
but think
Well,
about it. You know, you at least knew why they might be crying. You know, why she might be upset. You know, because you're in pain. You've just had surgery, whatever. Your brains are sort of at the same level, but imagine how discomforting it would be if you had no clue why someone was acting the way they were with you. You know, that can be incredibly uh, troubling to someone who has dementia. So you know, I think that is I think there's just, you know, it's just so hard to connect. And you know, one of the strategies that I learned probably too late is to meet the person with Alzheimer's where they are. If they're saying things that are you know, irrational or just untruthful, that, you know, part of you as a rational person wants to tell them the truth because you think that's the best way to confer dignity to someone, not to lie to them, not to endorse fictions that they may have. But what you learn as a caregiver is that the more you tell painful truths, the more suffering you confer. You know, my father forgot my mother died. And he would ask me, "Where's your mom?" And I would tell him, "Mom died," because I didn't know what else to say, because he and I had always been straight with each other. And I felt like I had to continue that, even when he had Alzheimer's. My brother, who had always been straight with him too, had a different attitude, which was, you know what? We're going to tell him that mom just isn't here. We're going to tell him that mom is, you know, out shopping, or she'll be here shortly. And the reality is that he would forget that he even asked where she was. And then maybe an hour later, he might ask again. But when I told him that she died, he experienced that grief as if for the first time, every time. And that's just not right. That's not fair. You know, we have this idea of ethics and morals, like telling the truth, to uphold dignity in someone, you know, and most relationships that works, but it only works if you're kind of like cognitively in the same plane. When you're in different planes, sometimes these kinds of whatever you want to call it, therapeutic deception is what some people call it, or validation therapy, telling people what they believe, because he literally believed that my mother was alive. When I told him my mother had died and that he attended the funeral, he thought I was lying. And he became incredibly upset, as anyone would, if, you know, if I told you that, you know, someone you love was dead, and you had no clue that could be the case. So, you know, it's a very challenging caregiving problem.
well, doctor, everything you're saying is you know, is quite deep, and you know, one of the things I noticed over time is that quite often the people who feel the most guilt are the people who have the least reason to feel guilty. But they're the most sensitive to right and wrong, so they feel the most guilt. And the people who really should feel bad about themselves are oblivious to it. I could imagine that in certain cases you thought you would jog his memory, and I imagine there were cases when actually things did. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. You know, a distant memory did come back into it. And maybe at some point you realized that the law of diminishing returns had kicked in, and you needed to treat it differently.
Back off. Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm sure that you're probably feeling worse about it than you need to be, because you were a devoted son at your father's side, and that's, as you said, that already is above what most people do. And you know,
Yeah.
as far as the paying, my father had a month in the hospital. Hatem knew my father very well, where he died of cancer, and I was really taken aback by the difference in the uh, compassion of the various nurses that he was dealing with. You know, he had pain in one sort or another, and if he had some pain and needed a pain medicine or something, some nurses would stop what they were doing and immediately attend to him. You know, they you could see that, oh, he's, and other nurses would finish their conversation, finish their coffee, you know, not really. Yeah. And and believe me, they're not the ones feeling guilty. Anyway,
Yeah. Yeah. You know, and I think you bring up a point, which we should address. Again, you know, it's sort of a deep point, maybe a serious point. So I don't know how,
yeah.
you know, we should be discussing these things on this podcast, but whatever. You know, the fact is that the structure of families in America is just makes it really hard to care for someone who's elderly, because you know, in the past, like I'd say, even in the early 20th century, um, you know, people were living on farms. They lived in multi-generational, you know, homes. There was always someone around to help out. And even in some countries, you know, like I was born in India, there's still sort of, I would say, multi-generational families are still the norm. And even when families are kind of becoming more nuclear, there's still this sense that, you know, we owe our elders help when they start to decline.
Mhm.
And although in India there are nursing homes being built and in urban areas or whatever, but for the most part, the family feels the responsibility to take care. And you know, in America, I'd say that you know, because of the changing in the sort of family structures, um, that's a great thing in many ways, right? I mean, people, you know, kids can grow up and move off the farm. You know,
Mhm.
they can go out and they can blaze their own paths, follow their careers. Women can work outside the home. I mean, there are a lot of good things, but you see uh, how this model fails when someone gets sick.
Mhm.
And what ends up happening is that one person bears the brunt, usually someone who's female, in my experience. You know, a daughter-in-law, they have to quit work. They, you know, and families can go bankrupt caring for, you know, people who are, you know, who don't have long-term care insurance, and need you know, 24-hour help. Either,
Mhm.
you know, it's very hard to find someone to hire to bring into the home, and then nursing homes are extremely expensive, and most people don't realize that the government doesn't really give a shit.
Right.
They don't care. You know, like Medicare won't pay for anything, um, except if you've been in the hospital, maybe when you leave, maybe for a couple of weeks, they'll send a visiting nurse or whatever. But for the most part, if you're like have a chronic degenerative neurological condition like dementia, Medicare is like, it's on the family. And and families literally have to spend on average something like $80,000 a year. Most families can't afford that, you know. They literally will go bankrupt. And then you talk about all the opportunity costs with loss of income, loss of, you know, job productivity. You know, it's a huge
Uh,
problem.
I
Also,
have. Oh,
go
God.
ahead.
No, no, go
Go ahead.
ahead.
Well, just you're bringing another like a huge issue, which is there are trade-offs to everything that we, you know, don't really factor in. There's trade-offs to the cultural changes, trade-offs to feminism, trade-offs to raising the minimum wage, trade-offs to better health care that's expensive. I mean, there's so many, and if you find yourself on the wrong side of one of these situations where the greater good has been served in so many ways, but you are on the other side of that trade-off, It's a bitter pill. You described it very well. Can we talk about some of the mechanics? I'm 60. Don't remind me. I'm 61. I'm going to be 62, and of course, I have trouble remembering names as well as I used to. I don't think I could win Jeopardy like maybe I at least could have been in the running. But I'm told that these are normal signs of aging. Um, what are what are the real markers where you know you have a problem, and what lifestyle change really can change your trajectory if you are on that path to dementia?
Yeah, well, there are a couple of things. I mean, there's early onset and late onset dementia. Early onset, there's pretty much nothing you could do. Early onset is primarily a genetic condition, and some of the new drugs that are being developed, there are some real issues about whether the adverse effects of using those drugs in people with early onset dementia outweigh the benefits. So early onset, you're kind of screwed, unfortunately.
Early would be how? At what age was
Like
tip?
like 50s.
50s. Okay.
Yeah. Um, yeah. How old are you?
61.
Yeah. You don't have an early onset for
Okay.
sure.
All right. That's
So that's
How much do I owe you?
You get a free consultation.
my bill will be in the mail. But late onset, many of us develop it because the biggest risk factor for late onset dementia is age. It's the accrual of injury in the brain, and the accrual of injury can be because of risk factors that actually in many cases affect the heart. So so things like high blood pressure predisposed to late onset dementia, diabetes, and then there are like plaques and tangles that are, very visible, predominant in early onset, but they also are part of late onset, but they may be a response to other factors that increase with age, like inflammation. So the bottom line is early onset is primarily genetic. Late onset, I would say, is primarily lifestyle, and there are things that you can do. So some of the things also can be applied to heart health. So exercise, controlling your blood sugar, controlling your blood pressure, eating right, and eating right could mean many different things and many different diets. But I always think eating right, I sort of follow Michael Pollan's, simple 3-step rule for what is a healthy diet, which is eat food like real food, like whole food, not food that your grandmother wouldn't recognize as food. Not too much, mostly plants.
Mostly plants.
That's his prescription. And that's the prescription that I follow, and I usually tell my patient to follow. I mean, some people argue for, Mediterranean diet, which I think has a lot of data behind it, and other people, argue for other kinds of diets, vegan, so on. But I think the main thing is if your diet is predominantly plants, not exclusively plant-based, but predominantly, and you don't eat too much of it, you're probably in good.
There's this Egyptian
space.
joke: if you're under 50, you can eat a cow. If you're over 50, you eat what the cow eats.
Right. There you go.
Grass.
Yeah.
But by the way,
exactly.
if you reverse engineer your father's life, which lifestyle choices would you say
he never exercised?
He never exercised.
He never exercised.
So
but
what?
He did do some things, and I was going to mention. So some of the things we can do are also good for your heart. Other things are exclusively for the brain. And one of the things, I'd say a couple of things. One is keep yourself cognitively,
Active.
stimulated.
Yeah.
Okay. So reading novels is a great way because you have to sort of follow many different plot lines and characters and remember who they are. So in fact, one of the first things that tends to go in people who develop cognitive impairment is they stop reading fiction because it's so hard to follow. So I'd say that's one thing, puzzles, crossword puzzles, learning a new language, learning a new instrument. These are all ways of building up cognitive reserve. Cognitive reserve is like, how much water do you have in the bucket? And and dementia is the hole in the bucket that's like draining it. And if you start with more water in the bucket, it's going to take longer to develop, palpable cognitive impairment. So one of the neurologists said, it's a simple math problem. How many neurons do you start with versus how many neurons do you lose because of the dementia? So cognitive reserve is really important. The other thing that I investigate a lot in my book and explore, especially in light of how my father lost a lot of his friends and whatever, is social reserve. People who are lonely with dementia do a lot worse. Their disease progresses faster. People who become widows or widowers, like my father, they do worse. So I would say that a couple of things, and this probably also applies to the heart, is good social connections as much as you can, realizing that most people don't want to be friends with people who have dementia. But families, I think, can really continue to, involve their loved one in family activities and all. That's super important. I used to visit my dad probably 5 times a week, usually after work, after the hospital. But it wasn't easy because I had my own family, and my kids would want to know why I wasn't home for dinner or why I wasn't home to help them with their homework or whatever. So there are trade-offs. But it was important to me to visit him. So that's I think that was one question you had. And
But so you answered. And Hatem, did you have a question? Because I have more.
Yeah, I was just gonna comment on that. Most of the things that you said was like a body, things like health. I thought it was more like a brain, but then you explained at the end. So these things that we hear, like working puzzles and stuff like that. Like the more you involve your brain, this is a strategy as well. This is correct, right?
Yeah, but I would say that once dementia kicks in, it's limited how much benefit doing puzzles and learning a new instrument, whether you can even learn a new instrument at that. Yeah. So I think it's important to, set up those protections before the disease really takes hold.
But to Noam's question was like what you do to prevent it, it's overall health, but also make your brain works more.
Yeah, it's vascular health, which is cardiovascular health, which is eating right, exercising, so on. And then there's the cognitive reserve part, and then there's the social connections part.
Okay.
And I think all those things are really important.
Now we understand in some way, I'm sure, the reason that exercise helps the body because the blood flow and keeping the arteries clear, all the reasons that the brain would be healthier with a healthier body. Do we understand physiologically how psychological matters benefit? Like how does staying active and friendly with having a good social life keep the brain healthy, or the opposite? How does it make the brain less healthy? How does learning an instrument defend against dementia, which is a physiological thing, as you're describing? I mean, you can see it on MRIs and stuff. So how does it? Do we understand how that works, or we just know it works?
I mean, we know it works. We know that people who exercise, for example, do better on short-term memory tests. There is evidence that certain hormones that increase connections between neurons, like brain-derived neurotropic factors, go up, or levels go up in the brain after exercise. So And we know that learning a new instrument, it essentially increases synaptic density. Synapses are the connections between neurons, and they're the what predominantly gets affected when dementia takes hold. It's like the neurons stop communicating with each other. Eventually, there's so much misfolded proteins and all that the neurons start to die. But initially, it's the synapses. So the more synapses you can develop, the more resistant, I think, to the disease process you would be. You know, there's a lot about the brain we don't understand, but social connections, doing things that make you happy, affect, the dopamine pathways that have effects on memory and cognition as well.
Is
Um,
is is there an analogy here? I know a little bit that when some people have strokes, and in some people, their brain manages to create a new circuit in some way and restore something that the stroke,
yeah.
and other people, they're dead in the water. It never recovers. And does something similar happen when plaques are formed? Certain brains manages to work around, and other brains just don't.
There's a lot that we don't understand. There are brains that that have been analyzed after death,
Hmm.
where the brain was the person had profound dementia and they had very little plaques and tangles. And then there are people who have a lot of plaques and tangles and really don't manifest any dementia. So dementia is not all about the plaques and tangles. That's something that I think we have learned over the last 100 years or so since Alzheimer discovered plaques and tangles. And for a long time, we thought dementia is just plaques and tangles. But now we know that people can have a lot of them and really not have that much dementia, maybe because they have a lot of cognitive reserve to begin with. Like higher education is a protective factor in preventing dementia from taking hold.
But do they sort out cause and effect there? Isn't it also true that people who already had more cognitive reserve would have higher educations, right?
Yeah,
Less,
well, yeah,
yeah.
right. I mean, yeah. So there's, um, but educational experiences, cognitive experiences tend to increase synaptic density and confer
Hmm.
cognitive reserve. Um, the but the big thing that people don't really talk about, I think, is the psychosocial reserve. Is we tend to forget that when we marginalize people with dementia and we make them lonelier than they already are, that we are actually hurting them. That we're hurting their brains.
Right.
We are causing their brains to decline faster. And that's something that I think uh, most caregivers would do well to remember. And it's again not easy and easy to get frustrated. I've been there, um, but it's not good for the person you're taking care
It's probably not good. I'm raising kids. It's probably an analogy there too. You get frustrated with your kids,
of. Yeah.
and
Oh, all the
and
time.
and sometimes
Yeah.
you tell them to try harder, and they actually don't have the ability to do it, and then you traumatize them in a different way.
Yeah.
Um,
Does
Life is very rich, Hatem. Go ahead.
yeah, does PTSD affect that in any way or no? Like, because
Uh,
I know like PTSD, like you try to close that part of your memory. You don't want to remember anything. And you end up not remember, like I do that. And then I end up not remembering anything that happened that time or dates or
mhm.
anything. Does that affect you at all or no?
I mean, I think PTSD definitely affects cognitive performance,
Yeah.
for sure. Yeah. Um,
Cultures have any effects on it? Where you live, does it vary from a state to state? Anything like that? City life versus regular life, married versus
you
not
know,
married?
we don't know,
Yeah.
but there is uh, a, a some good evidence that air pollution, heavy air pollution, can predisposed to dementing changes in the brain. So, you know.
And just before we let you go, just for the sake of my wife, it is normal for a man to forget his anniversary, correct?
I, I tell you, my dad also had Alzheimer's during his last days, and I brought him here to stay with me, and then he decided he want to go back with my brother in Egypt. That more familiar stuff, and the doctors recommend. But anyway, so he used to come, and he loves this Arabic Egyptian news show. And he want to watch it every day, and the show is only 5 days a week. And he's like, I want to watch it. And so I started playing reruns, knowing that he's not gonna remember, And it worked until one time I came back, and he was so upset. I was like, Dad, what's going on? There was a terrorist attack in Egypt where they attacked a hospital, and he's like, this is the third time they attacked the hospital.
That's great. Yeah,
I was like,
I'll now I remember, Noam, you asked me, well, how do you know when to be worried?
Yes.
And, it's easy to worry when you forget, maybe not your anniversary, but, like you forget names of acquaintances, or the right word won't come to you.
And I forget I forget numbers.
Yeah.
Like how much did something I paid for something. Yeah.
Yeah. So like I'll forget where I parked my car in the hospital parking lot. But I don't forget that I have a car.
Right.
And I don't forget the make and model of my car. So, it's really a matter of degree. There are changes that happen in the brain as we get older that take some of the detail out of our memories. Like, when you were 25, maybe if you went camping with your family or whatever, you might remember specific aspects of that experience that is autobiographical memory, and those details are certain smells, sights, sounds, whatever, are processed in a part of the brain called the hippocampus. That part of the brain shrinks and gets less functional as we get older. So we may not remember all the details of our trip with our dad camping, but we might just remember that we went camping. We don't remember all the specifics. That's sort of normal. Word finding difficulties are normal, whatever. But it's the things that something is really wrong. Like my mother stopped me one day and she's like, does your dad have Alzheimer's? Like, she knew even before we did, because the deficits were so,
obvious,
severe, and obvious, right? So he would like stop the car when he got lost and stop traffic and ask for directions. It's not normal. So so I think it's really a matter of degree, but there are changes that are happening, and for most people, they don't mean or signify that you're developing dementia.
One thing I do notice about my own memory, and I have no question it's deteriorated in a way that's not explained by what I'm about to say, is that novelty has a tremendous effect. If I take a vacation for 5 days, I've never been before.
Yeah.
I can remember moment after moment, and this, and the restaurant, and the hotel room. But the last 5 days of my life at home, it could all collapse into, was that yesterday? Was that 3 days ago? Because I've done it a million times already.
Yeah.
And the brain just doesn't store recurring things the same way as it shouldn't. It wouldn't make sense to do that, right?
Yeah, that's so true. Some of the things that even people with dementia remember the best are sort of in this phase of life, let's say between 10 and 30, where many of the big things happen. You graduate from high school, maybe you go to college, you move away from your home, you meet your first, partner, maybe you get married, you have a kid. These are like life-changing events, and they're highly novel. And even people with dementia will remember those things.
Yeah.
It's just that the day-to-day stuff, I think it's hard for everyone to remember because we don't have anything to latch onto. Was it, and I think that's also why when we were younger, um, because we're making so many memories, because everything's so novel, I think that time slows down. Like remember the summers when we were kids, it seemed like the summer lasted forever. I don't know what I did last summer.
No,
It's
no.
the same 3 months.
I
I
think
went to work and, did my usual shit. And,
I think that's 100% correct, and I've thought that for a long time. People say,
Yeah.
"Oh, time goes faster because it's a slower, it's a smaller proportion of your overall life." I say, I don't think so, because
No,
when
I
I
don't
go
think
away
so.
for 2 weeks,
I think, yeah. So,
time
yeah,
stops.
yeah. So I think one thing you point out, which is good, that your listeners should like sometimes I'll deliberately drive a novel way home, even if it's longer,
Yeah.
just to create an experience. And I think that's really
And
important.
it's a good excuse if you're married. Honey, why are you late? Well,
I was novelty. You want me to be healthy, don't you?
so
Hatem, we have to let him go.
yeah. Last thing is like,
Yeah.
why do we don't know too much about it? Is it like underfunding, or is it like why there's a
I mean, yeah. So, we have funded the 2 other great killers in American society: heart disease, which I've been a bit beneficiary, from the funding. So I'm very glad for that, and cancer. Dementia has, relatively speaking, gotten much less funding. So I think part of it is that, but I think part of it is also that just our knowledge of the brain is just in its infancy. Like, all the big questions in medicine today, many of them are related to the brain. And some of the most profound questions of human existence are related to the brain. Like, how does meat up in your skull create a sense of consciousness and a sense of personality and a sense of, being? How's that happen? We don't know that. So there's a lot we need to
Well,
learn.
thank you so much for being here. And My Father's Brain: Life in the Shadows of Alzheimer's is out in paperback today. And it's a great book. And you watch your TED Talk as well. And we'd love to have you again soon, whenever you're free, or come hang out with us one day.
Yeah,
Yeah,
come to. Are you in New York? I forget which hospital, or if they said.
I'm at Long Island Jewish mostly, or North Shore.
Mhm.
But yeah, I'm on Long Island. But yeah, I mean, I've been in Manhattan the last 3 nights. So yeah,
Oh yeah, please come
all
to the
the time.
Comedy Cellar. Hatem can arrange it for you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I will.
I will. All right, excellent.
All right.
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
sir.
Have a
Okay.
great day.